Okay, what's up guys? Listen, so I'm gonna start here with the little presentation thing on responsive design. Basically, this will just cover like the tools and things I've been using and have been finding useful when developing. So let me just have a quick rundown of what's gonna happen. Well, yeah, so we're covering firstly how to emulate Canvas on your local machine, because this has sped up my development by like 100%. And basically I develop locally and then copy and paste the code into Canvas, but in a way that it kind of makes sense so that you don't have to change a bunch of code when you go to Canvas. Um, After that, we'll be doing display grid and then display flex, and then I'll use Nyama as an example for custom layouts. So when I say custom layouts, I mean like when you look at the PSDs, we get a design for desktop version, but we never get a design for something like an iPad or phone. So I found that having that entire design just shrink down for certain components is actually better than having Bootstrap kind of move it around in a way that you don't want it to. So on display grid, we'll do how these different properties work. I think these are like the most important because display grid will mostly be used for stuff like image galleries, etc. And then display flex, it's useful, but it's also exactly sort of what Bootstrap does. So we probably won't need it that much, but it's cool to know in case we need to build stuff based on the flex. For that, I'll build a layout, which they call the Holy Grail layout. I don't know if you guys ever heard of it, where there's a top bar, then there's two sections on the side, then there's a main content in the center, and then a footer, and then having that respond is quite a difficult thing to do. So I'll be building it without looking at any code, so I guess I'll mess up a few things as well, but whatever, we can learn together. Then I think I'll switch these two around and first build the nav bar because that's a bit simpler. Then the custom layouts I'll use in Nyama, like I said, and sort of go into why I used EMs in certain places, why I used view width or view height, and then I'll do a separate thing with position relative and absolute and show you the actual benefit of that, because this has saved me quite a bit, but it can also break a lot of things, so there's context around that. Then how to get your text to respond to screen sizes, and we'll play with some backgrounds like full screen backgrounds, how a better way to scale them down in terms of background size and position and those things. And then yeah, I guess after this you can just go, this is like some of the stuff I check out, MDN, Mozilla Development Network, Design Course, AcademMind, and CSS Tricks. Those are like my front end things that I really like watching. I think you guys will probably know Maximilian, the German guy from YouTube. So yeah, let's get started. So to start off, I'm gonna kind of try and show you how I emulate Canvas on my local machine. The important part is that Canvas has the ability to do includes, and I really love that because then you have smaller components to work with instead of these large HTML files that you have to scan through and kind of struggle to use. So I'm using VS Code as my code editor, but I guess you can use any code editor. Okay, so let's just get started. I'm going to create a index.html file, pretty basic. Then there's a nice shortcut on VS Code. I can just do an exclamation mark and it does like the boilerplate. I'll name this document responsive tutorial, and oops, so for this to work, I guess I anyway need to include all the CSS and stuff that we have in Canvas, and I have those on a different screen here, so I'm just gonna kind of copy them over. I guess you guys have seen this quite a lot because you do work with it a lot. So I'll just slam that right below this piece, right before the title. So what this is doing, it's bringing in Font Awesome for the fonts, I mean the little icons and stuff, and then Bootstrap, the CSS, and then MDB's CSS, and then my custom CSS, and then I'm bringing in jQuery, and then below that all the other JavaScripts. This is basically copy and paste from MDB's tutorial. The next part is the important part to emulate Canvas, and I think I'm going to write this from scratch because then I can explain what I'm doing as I go. So this has to be below all the script imports, but we'll just do another script tag, and this JavaScript will be loaded in the head. What we can do is create this type of function where you immediately sort of invoke the function. It's the same as doing window.ready or something like that. It just waits for the window to be ready, and then just call the function. Oops. And then inside this function, we want to sort of have a way to do the includes on our local machine. So we'll create a variable. Actually, let's create a constant. We'll call it includes, and then this includes constant will have a jQuery selector, which is sort of selecting by attribute, and attributes are always in these square brackets. And I'm going to call this attribute data include. I guess you can call it what you want, but I like that name. And then for the actual logic, I'm going to do a jQuery, and I'm pretty sure you can do the $ here as well, but I'll just do jQuery.each, and this is basically a way of looping over the elements. And what I'm going to loop over is the includes constant that we just created on top there. So this takes a callback function to do stuff with that selected includes. And what we want to do is for each include, we want to create a file, and this file needs to be pulled from a folder called views, so that we can just create separate HTML files in the views folder and add a div, something like we can just do div, then add an attribute data includes equals, let's call it grid, because that's what we're going to be doing first. So at the moment this won't do anything because it's just a div with a attribute, but what we do up here is we loop over these in the HTML, and we say that we create a file, and this file will be in the views folder. So this will have to be in the same directory as the indexed HTML, but in that views folder will be a HTML file that we created, but its name we have to sort of call like this. We take the jQuery and select this, the current thing that we sort of on, and then take the data and we plus the HTML, the .html, because that's what the file's extension is going to be. And what we want to do with that is we take this thing that we just selected and we load the actual file that we defined up here. So this is selecting the HTML, the div, and it's going to sort of plug in whatever file we create in the views folder. And just to show you this, I think let me save this. Let me create the views folder, and in the views folder we create a new file, and this has to be the exact same name as this name. So we'll make it grid.html. You don't have to define grid.html here because we are appending grid.html, so that's fine. This is the grid part that's being pulled from there. Okay, so I've just debugged it a little bit, but I had a server running on a different port, so I just closed down that server. So all I have to do now is click on this little go live button. It starts the server and it just opens it up for me. and obviously this is an empty page because we don't really see anything. But if we inspect this, we'll check the errors. Cannot read added listener. Okay, that's fine. And something is not found. Oh, the fav icon. Okay, that's cool. Live reload enabled. So anyway, what we want to inspect is in the element, there's in the body we've included that data includes grid. So that's cool that it's been injected. But to really see if there's anything happening, we need to go back to the code editor and actually go into grid and add some markup. So I'm just going to add an h1 and say hello from grid. Save that. Then in the HTML we can do a little reload, and something is not working. Okay, so I have to test this, and I wrote the hello from grid, but I made an error, and maybe you guys picked this up, but I named it data include, and over here it's data includes, so we have to fix that. And if we look now, we see hello from grid, and we know Bootstrap is working because of the font, so that is awesome. Okay, so to get started with grid, there's basically two things you need to focus on when you work with grid, and that's the container element and the children inside the container. So to emulate that, I'm going to do, I can't call it container because that's a Bootstrap class, but I'll call it wrapper. And then inside the wrapper, I'll create a few divs called child, and just copy those, and we'll add some images to these children so that we can actually see the grid in action. So I actually have a few links that I've already copied, but that's okay. Let's just do image, and the source, we'll just paste that link because we already have, I mean, it's all the same image, but that's fine. We'll just explain what's going on here. So this should look ugly at the moment. Let's have a look in yeah, so it's just added these three images in the normal way HTML gets added, stacked on top of each other. And display grid provides us a great way to deal with images and make nice looking layouts. So I'm actually just gonna put the style tag right in this HTML file, which is also a nice way to emulate Canvas, because mostly we'll do styles in separate files so that we keep separation of concern, and we can actually read where styles are coming from. And we still will have our long CSS file. We can actually write the styles here and then go paste them in CSS with some comments saying like grid section, so that everyone knows what's going on. But in order to start, we have to take the wrapper, and this is probably the most important thing at first, is that you have to declare the display of this item is going to be grid. And when you do that, I think nothing will happen now because we haven't set any properties on the grid, but because that's grid, it gives us the availability to change every single child component inside of that wrapper. And we'll have to set some other properties. The most used properties, in my opinion, are grid template columns. And this is a cool thing. You can actually define your children elements as fractions. So I can say that my first child needs to be one fraction, the second child needs to be one fraction, and the third child needs to be one fraction. So that'll split up this entire wrapper. It'll take every single child, and because there's 3 children, I have to declare 3 fractions, but each child will now have a exact amount of ratio to the previous child. So let's just save that and have a look at it. Yeah, so you'll see now they display columns, and if we do rows here, we'll see that it actually just stays as it is because it's automatically rows. But what if we want to sort of make a little space between these? All we have to do is go into the styles and say grid gap, and we'll just make it 10 pixels, just to have a little gap in between these images, nice and easy. But I don't want to have it on top of each other, I'll rather put it next to each other, so that's the only item we change to this. Then we'll have a nice layout, and because we've defined the spacing, this has probably moved up a bit, but the way you can look at it is this: you just inspect it with Chrome and it actually will it will show you the different grids. If I hover over this wrapper, you can see that each grid has a gap in between it because we defined that 10 pixel gap, and if we change that to 0, they move closer and the grid is actually right up against each other. So another problem you might see is that why are these not in, they're all aligned left. Usually you'd want them to be centered because it just looks better and the spacing and everything will be better. So there's a few ways to do this. My favorite way is actually just taking the container or the parent element and saying justify items. That's a CSS class that actually, if you take center that, it immediately pops everything over to the center, which spares you a lot of time and effort. And maybe you want to have the images fill the actual grid. All you have to do is, let's go back into the CSS in the file so that we don't forget what we're doing. We'll remove the grid gap because we're doing columns anyway, and we have added the justify items. So all we have to do here is add the justify items so that it stays there, and we'll do center. And grid is so new that VS Code doesn't even recognize it as a property, but it will work. If we go here and we refresh, yeah, all still good. But the gap is a little bit too big for me, and I really want the images to be a bit closer to each other. So okay, so effectively we want the images to fill up the grid and probably just leave a little gap. So what we have to do is we have to target the wrapper and then target the child, and then in the child we want the image. So that's very specific calling, but we could have just said all images and left out the wrappers and the child. Actually, I think I'll do that. And then images need to be width of 95%, because the 95% means that it will take 95% of its parent container, and its parent is the child, which is each little piece in the grid. So if the child is defined, we will see that the images don't change, because you need to have percentages on your parent in which the image lies. So we'll call .child and set the width to 100%, and this should provide us with a nice looking layout. And if we inspect that, we'll see that these are now filling up 95% of those grids. So if you look at that, the images now take up 95% of the grid, but the alignment is off. We don't want this white gap this side and nothing on this side. So the way to fix that, instead of actually making the child 100% and the image 95%, which kind of breaks the grid, because on the grid itself you have a if we inspect this, you have the wrapper, which is the parent component, and you can have a look at the grid there. So if the child is 100%, that means that it fills the entire grid now, and aligning its center, justifying its center, does not improve the centering of the image, because the image is inside of the child. We could probably do something like margin 0 auto. Yeah, see, that doesn't work either. So the best way to go about this is, instead of adding those classes to the child, let's make the child 95% and fill that 95% with the image. That means that inside of this grid block there will be a child that makes up 95%, but because it's centered, it will actually be centered in that grid block. The image will always be left aligned inside of the child. So let's make it 100% so that there is no left or right. And if we save that and go look, it should now have equal spaces on both sides. And if we look at the responsiveness, I use this little Chrome plugin called Mobile thing, and I always start with the iPad Air because it's actually it actually scales with your device. It doesn't matter how big or small the screen is, the images will scale up to that point. So this is good for something like having a feature that needs to stay like this and not where Bootstrap kind of like stacks it on top of each other. So another specific problem that I've seen before is when I mean, if you look at this grid, it's 100% height, and it's quite easy to sort of code this with Bootstrap or whatever. But a lot of the times the images kind of need to be at specific spots. So with grid, that's quite simple to do. Let's just change the CSS here so I can sort of show you. I'm gonna make the wrapper have a fixed height of let's say 400 pixels, and then instead of a width on the image, I'll just put a height so that it's smaller than the actual grid so that we can move it around. I'll make this 50 pixels. Actually, let's make it, yeah, let's give it 50. And then look at the actual thing. So now you can see these are actually aligned to the top left of each grid, and we kind of need a way to, because I've many times in responsive design I've wanted to move this to the center of that, or this needs to go to the bottom or something like that. And with display grid, that's quite easy to do. Instead of instead of justify items, we'll say let's align all the items in here as center. And for that, we'll have to set a let's align item center. And there we go. The images are nice and centered inside the grid. And that's like one line of CSS where doing margins and paddings and stuff like that could be difficult. We can also, if we want to have custom for each item, so sometimes we want to actually have these be on different levels of the grid, and we can target them one by one and move them around, and specifically 3 ways. Let's add child 1, child 2, and child 3 here, and then we'll just have to keep these consistent. Okay, and then let's say we want this child to be aligned right here at the top, this child to stay center, and this one at the bottom of the grid. And to do that, you would think that you have to target the image, and before I started I actually did target the image, but I actually went on MDN, as you saw. That's one of my favorite resources, and read about this. So you always have to target the immediate child within the container, and that will align the items. So the way you do that is, so child 1 we want to have specifically at the top. So the property for that is align self, and then we want to say start, because we want to align it at the start of the grid, which is the top. And there we have it at the top. This one we want to keep at the center, so that's fine. We have defined the main alignment as center, so we don't have to go and re-center it. And then for child 3, we want to have it align self at the end, and that will allow us to have this nice looking grid thing. Okay, so let's get into display flex, one of my favorite CSS properties. As you can see, I've done the same thing. I've included a data include flex, which is the same as doing a include in Canvas, or not the same, but it emulates it. I've just commented out the grid so that it doesn't interfere with our HTML. And then the flex file, I've instantiated it with a wrapper and 3 items. For now, these have just normal widths, heights, backgrounds, so that they look like this. 3 little squares, 20 pixels width and 100% height. They get their height from the parent, which is the wrapper, which is 100 pixels. So what we effectively want to do is just get these all on one line, and that's easy to do. We just add the display flex, and in the back end this does quite a bit more than just puts it on one line, but as you can see, each of these are a direct child of the wrapper, and that makes them flex. And to see this a bit better, we can add this border that I commented out. The wrapper is this entire section here, and these are the 3 flexed items. They are being put into that wrapper, and they automatically align to the left if they have smaller width than the full width of the wrapper. In order to start, I will start playing with the order of things. If we look, it's red, blue, black. But what if we want to sort of pop this item over to the end? For that, we have a property called order, and order goes directly on the child component, and order is naturally set to 1. So they all have an order of 1 or 0. I'm not sure, but they are all in the same order. So instead of defining an order for each one, say I want to put this item at the end, so that means this needs to shift up and this needs to shift up, which means this needs to have an order of 1, this an order of 2, and then this an order of 3. But since they all have an order of 0, I think, all we have to do is add an order of 1 to this one, which means it's bigger than both of these, which should pop it up to the end. To see it happen in real time, sort of, we can take the order off here and it goes back to the beginning. If we want to, let's remove that. If we want to take this black one and pop it at the beginning, instead of doing 1, 2, 3, we can just go to the black one and say order -1, because they all have an order of 0, and if I do this, it's going to pop right in the front. That's a nice way to sort of organize your stuff inside your flex. But the next thing we'll be looking at is the actual sort of layout of the flex. So flex, the container, has a property called flex direction. And flex direction provides us with a few options, and they're all listed here. Mainly, you'll choose between column or row, and then you get the reverse and the row reverse, and the default is row. So if we set it to row, nothing will happen. But let's look at row reverse. What row reverse does is it basically starts it from the other end and reverses the order. And here you can see it's blue, black, red, because we've popped the red onto the back here. So let's just comment that out, delete that so that it's in the right order. So now it's reversing the row. If you have a bunch of images, they'll naturally go image 1, image 2, image 3, image 4, and then if you reverse, it'll be image 1, image 2, image 3, image 4. So that could be useful if you have images that need to be in a certain order, or if you have blocks of text that need to be aligned somehow. Then we have also the option to make the direction as a column. And this is useful because it automatically sort of sets the items above each other. And if you look at this, you'll see that this is a weird thing that's happening, because this thing has a height of 100 pixels. All 3 of these have a height of 100%, and that means it should fill this whole thing. But what flex does is it doesn't care if your items have a height that is bigger than the actual container. It will compress it. So if we go back to row to visualize this better, so these will be pushed in here because they all have 20 pixels, so it's quite easy to put them in there. But if we look at the width of this wrapper, it has a width of 1920, the screen's width. So that means if the addition of these three items width exceed 1920, it might break because it's not going to fit. So let's sort of force that to happen. We can set the width to, let's make it big. Let's say 1,000 pixels each, which makes it 3,000 in total, which is much bigger than the screen width. But what will happen is Flex doesn't care. It won't make it bigger than what's the actual container. It will make sure that everything fits in, and that's just how Flex works. And the way you can combat that is, let's change these back to reasonable values. Let's make them all 500 pixels. No, that'll still fit. Let's make them all 700 pixels. That should just about exceed the width. So if you look at it now, it's kind of all being squished in. And the way we can fix that is, here we define a property called flex wrap, and the normal value is no wrap, which means it doesn't break onto the next line. But we want it to wrap because we need our stuff's width to be accurate. And what it will do is, if the third one doesn't fit in there, it's just going to pop it over to the next row, so that it still maintains its width, but it doesn't fit in there, so it's going to wrap it down. And if you want it to wrap this way instead of that way, we have a nice little property called wrap reverse, and this will pop it up. Okay, but it's popping it up to the top here. So instead of wrapping it like that way, it's going to wrap it upwards. To visualize that, I guess we can do a margin top of 150 pixels, and you can see it's wrapping upwards instead of downwards to the next line. And this could be useful if you have something at the bottom that needs to keep stacking up. And as you can see, this 100% height is still maintaining the height of the parent, even though it's wrapping up. So that's a nice little property we can use with Flex. So I'll just set it back to its squished up values, and the next thing I'll be looking at is grow. If we look at this layout, sometimes we just want this to be a certain width and maybe this to be a certain width, but we kind of want to fill the rest with whatever's in the middle, and we don't really want to set that value. So what we can do is, on this one, we'll set the width to, let's make it reasonable, say 300 pixels, and we want item 3 to be the same. So if we set these two items to 300 pixels and leave that at 700, what's going to happen is we will have our items here, but it won't fill this empty gap by itself. And you would think that if we just make this some ginormous value, that it will contain it. This is what will happen. It will contain it, but it won't keep your size at the value that you wanted them. It will sort of just squish them in there. And the way to combat that is with a property called flex grow. So all of them have a default value of flex grow 1. So in order to let the middle item grow more than the rest, we'll just set the flex grow to 2. Nope. Yeah, there we go. So the flex grow is causing, as if this it would be our 300 pixels, and flex grow is causing this to fill the rest. So let's look at a different property that's called flex bases. If we look at these elements, we've set width and flex grow to sort of fill the space, but There's another property called flex bases, and this property is almost exactly like width, but I will show you the difference. If we set a flex bases of 500 pixels and we just copy that over to the rest, they should all look like 500 pixels at the start of the row. So each of these are 500 pixels, and you would think that that's basically exactly what width is doing. You can just set that, but if you have flex bases set, that is the initial value that it's going to have when it starts out. And if you set this to column, the difference is that it does it for both. You don't have to define a height or width, you just do flex bases and then it will automatically set that. And because these are so large flex bases, which means it should be 500 pixels height each, but the parent is only 100 pixels high, you can guess what will happen. It will probably squish it all in to fit there, and there you can see that it's perfectly matched. So the next two properties we'll look at is very useful in responsive design, because we want to sort of be able to move these elements around, not just shift them and fill the gaps, but we sort of want to space them and have them be evenly spaced. And if we look at the response to this, they sort of just fill the gaps like that until the width becomes too big. So what we might want is on a large screen, we also, because on this small screen it's kind of, it looks good, it's in line, I mean it's evenly spread, but as soon as the screen gets large we have a problem, everything is left. So we have a few options for that. We can use a property on either the parent component or on the child components. So on the parent component, to sort of play with the way they move, we're going to use justify items. Justify content. And so to play with the spacing of the items, we're going to use a property called justify content. And so let's start with centering these items, just to see what that does. Now you can see the entire content, so all three of these together have been centered. And if we do end, and I think when you do flex, you have to do flex end and not just end like with the grid, you have to say flex end, it'll put them all on the end. So the default is flex start. But what if we actually want to play with the individual items, but we don't really want to go write CSS for each block? So there's another thing called justify items, and this will take every this will take every item and do something with it depending on what you set the value as. So if we say justify items space around, so justify content sort of gives us a nice way to play with the items inside the wrapper, but flex end, flex start, and flex center just moves everything up as a unit. And what we really want to do is sort of space them evenly. So justify content has a few options for that. We can do something called space between. And what that's going to do is it's actually going to split them to take up the same amount of white space between the items, excluding the outsides. So that might be useful for some responsive layout. I mean, if we look at the responsiveness here, you can see there we have the 3 columns, and that's nice. And if we grow it, where the white space appears, it just splits them up and it keeps them organized. Then if we want to sort of split the white space up evenly, we have a property called, or it states justify content, but we have a value here called space evenly. And this is going to give every single gap even space. So there's a property called space around, and if you look at these blocks, space around kind of gives them the same amount of space on both sides. So these two will have this amount of space on the left and right side, but if you look at this is kind of bigger than that, because what's actually happening is it has this on this side and that one has that on that side, so it's taking both of those into account, and that's where space evenly becomes important. If we do that and we check, then these gaps should be pretty much the same. They take the space and distribute it evenly. So for the next property, I've decided to shrink the blocks a little bit, make them a bit smaller than the container, because often your buttons won't fill up the container. So I'll be looking at this as like sort of a nav bar, and these will be different buttons inside the nav bar. So sometimes we want to actually just space them accordingly to the nav bar, and for that Flex provides us a property called align items. And align items goes on the parent component, and when you put align items on the parent component, it affects all the children. So we want all of them to be in the center, and that kind of just makes it nice and evenly distributed vertically. But what if we want to have sort of a special layout where this is on top and this is in the center and that's at the bottom? We'll have to target the children specifically. So we have center on the middle already, we don't have to play with that. But for this child, we'll have to say align self. So there's a few options here. We have baseline, center, flex end, flex start. So let's start with flex end on item 1. And what flex end does is it pushes it to the end of the column, or the height of the thing. So this one, I'm guessing we'll have to put flex start to have it according to our so we'll have to do align self flex start, and that'll align it to the beginning. And there we have a nice little special layout, and I'll point you guys to these documentation. As you can see, this is all the stuff I've just gone through, but there's a lot of stuff here that I didn't go through, but you can go play. It's on CSS Tricks Flexbox guide. My favorite Flexbox tutorials are on there, and they cover a lot of what I just did, probably a bit better, and also a bit more in detail. But these are the properties that I use the most. I don't really use more than this, because if you look at Bootstrap, it basically uses Flexbox to do everything. So as promised, I think we should get into building a navbar that is responsive. If we look at this code, it's basically the same code that I had now, but I just removed the extra stuff, so it looks like there's nothing. So what I want to do is sort of build a navbar that is responsive, and it also flexes the items to the end, and it has a nice background. So let's define the wrapper's stylings. That'll be the holder of the nav. For that, we'll do a background of, let's do a nice little see-through blackish type thing. We'll set the alpha value to 0.5, and we'll need a height on this. I like 60 pixels on a navbar. Let's look at that. So there we have our little navbar, and what we want to have is maybe a little logo here, and then we want a box here that contains a search thing and a search button. and then next to that we'll put in 3 nav items or something like that. So to start off with, I've just copied this this massive source attribute from Google just to get a logo in there, and we'll rename these so that we stay semantic. We'll call that the logo, and then we'll call this link, and let's do 3 links, and this we'll call the search box. And inside the search box we said we want an actual input and a button. Now this might look, let's say search, this might look a little bit broken, but let's see what we have. Okay, so currently we have a logo that's too big, a search box that is not where it needs to be, and absolutely no links. So what we need to do is sort of get these to flex the way we want them to flex. So we know we have the wrapper and it has display flex. Let's put some content in these links. Let's put an A tag and we'll just send it to there and we'll call it link. See if those appear. So there we have our 3 links. Because we've defined display flex on a wrapper, every of these 3 items are actually flexing. But as you know, flex aligns everything to the left, and that's why it looks like these are crammed up to the left here, and this image is too big for the navbar because we haven't set an attribute on it. So let's just make it smaller than the navbar. We'll make it a 50 pixel image, and that should make it fit. There we have it. And 2 things that we notice here is that everything gets aligned to the left because flex basis is row automatically, and there is no sort of height set on these items. I mean, there's no width set on them, so they won't fill up the thing or distribute evenly by themselves, but we kind of need to make that happen. And secondly, the height of the navbar is bigger than most of these items, and they all align to the top of the navbar. So what we might want to do is actually just flex this one to the start, flex this to the end, and actually flex this to the end. And we may want to put space around or something like that. So we'll start off by trying to get these to sort of be in the center of the navbar. And the way we do that is we can define that on the wrapper. We'll say align items center, and that should give us a nice centered navbar. That looks much better already. And the second problem we have is we sort of want all of these to be at the end, and we want to keep the Google logo at the start. And the problem we have is that all of these children are being flexed. So if we say justify content, and it would make sense to say flex end so that some of them are at the end, but the problem is now everything will move to the end and we need to keep one of them at the start. So the better option would be to create a div dot start items, and we can put the logo in the start items because that's what we sort of want it to be its own element. And then we'll make another div, call it end items. Now the end items have now the wrapper has 2 children, and only these 2 children will be flexed. So what we can do now is we can say justify content, and instead of trying to move it to flex end, flex start, whatever, we can say that we want space between them. So all the empty space will be spread in between these 2 things, and that will cause it to split up. But now we have a new problem. These items aren't being flexed anymore because they are outside of the flexbox. They are not a direct child of the flexbox anymore. They are inside here. And that's fine for the logo because it's only one element. There aren't any other elements, and the height is still taking care of that, and the align items is still being taken care of by start items. So what we need to do is we have to actually create another flexbox where these end items are being flexed. So that will also be a flexbox. We'll call that end items, and we'll say display flex. So now we're kind of nesting flexes, and this should make it back into a flexbox. So a nice way to do this is to actually increase the size of this start items and increase the size of this as well, because what we can use here is flex bases instead of width. So let's try that out. We have the start items, so we can target those. And what we want to do is set a flex basis, which is an initial value. We want that to be about, let's say, 20% of the flexbox. That won't really change anything, but now you can see this as an initial width that takes 20%. This we kind of want to be a little bit bigger, maybe up to here, so that we can maybe use the justify content attribute to spread them out. But we can't make them too big because then they'll be too far spread out. So let's play with that. Let's find a value. Let's use flex bases 40%, maybe double the logo size. Let's see what that does. Alright, so now everything in end items is aligned flex start, and the entire container has a flex basis of 40%. So what we want to do now is sort of get these items to flex, to have a flex justify as well. So we can target end items, which is a flexbox of its own now, and we want to spread those items inside. So what we want to do is say justify content, and this we kind of want to use space evenly because we want space on all sides. Let's see what that does. That gives us a nicely spread out navbar, and you'll see that these two aren't spread out because I've purposefully kept them together in a div called search box. So we've gotten to display flex today, and I really wanted to actually do this layout, but I've already been recording for more than an hour, and I think to sort of keep it studyable, I'll stop there for this tutorial and actually make this a video of its own on a new day, because this is covering just as much as we covered there, and this is a lot of custom stuff. So I'll be using Nyama as a example, but we are gonna actually rebuild it or look at the site and what is going on and how it's happening. So I think that requires a whole entire video of its own, and that also gives me the opportunity to finish in Nyama so that I can sort of, you know, practice these things and actually explain it well out of practice. So yeah, I guess you guys could start using flex and grid in your project so long. I know that doesn't really provide a lot of responsive you know, stuff to use in our implementation of responsive design, because mostly we'll be doing stuff that's very custom. But that's why I think it deserves a video of its own. And display grid and flex are just two tools that are very useful when Bootstrap doesn't allow for customization. And yeah, so I guess I'll see you guys in the next video. I'll probably do it by next week or this weekend, depending on when Nyama is completed. So let me know what you guys thought about the video, or text me or whatever, and we can have a chat about it. Cool.